Today's dedication is for Terax, who gave me a very generous 1 year's worth of subscriptions on Patreon. Alela Cunning Conqueror versus Uurg, Narci and Yarok. Looks like a decent opening hand for us. Well, mana-wise it is. We just pray that Kindred Discovery is going to stick around, really. Alright, we get into a Flash Fairy in the form of Mistbind Click. So let's go for an island into a Sol Ring. We can go for a turn 2 commander if we want to. Just have to hope our opponents don't have any removal, and we're up against 3 black players, so we'll see how that goes. Delighted Halfling from Yarok. Another turn 1 play, Utopia Sprawl. And there we see another one, Commune with the Spirits. And with that they reveal a Jungle Hollow. Okay, get into some more card draw in the form of Titan of Lityara, so we're just eager to hold on to the Sol Ring, really. Argument to be made for us holding off on our commander until we get down Kindred, but yeah, I think it's a good idea to go for our commander here. No means of protecting it, unfortunately, but we'll take the risk. Nothing from Yarok, just turning in sideways with the Delighted Halfling. And we see the first Enchantress from the Junk Enchantress deck. And no one's missing any plays yet. And then from the Golgari player we see Roaring Earth, so going to put plus counters on things on landfall. So we're managing to keep our commander, thankfully. Alright, and there is a Nimris, Una's Trickster. So, do we go for the Kindred Discovery? I mean, we've kind of got a second commander now, so even if we lose the Kindred Discovery or our commander, we've got Nimris, so yeah, let's go for the Kindred Discovery here. We can at least swing in and draw a card with it, so it's not totally useless. And we'll go into the left and make that Delighted Halfling swing in. They'll probably tap it during the first main phase, so I don't see that it'll do them too much harm. A Cloudstone Curio I would have been disappointed to draw into next turn, so hopefully that means there's a land on top now. Alright, and we did successfully goad the Delighted Halflings, so they are swinging in with that. I haven't cast any spells since the Mana Dork came in. And now a History of Benalia, the first saga from what we assume is a Saga tribal deck, so that cantrips and makes an awesome looking Knight token here. Probably one of the best looking tokens there is. Now, speaking of cool artwork, that is a Path to the Festival. Search for a basic land, put it onto the battlefield tapped. Alright, see if we manage to draw into a swamp here. We do not. That is a Fairy Mastermind. So we've got some flash creatures now at least. I think it would be a good idea to get down the Cloud of Fairies. And that will cantrip thanks to the Kindred Discovery, so untap 2 lands when it enters as well. Allows us to hold up probably the Nimris, Una's Trickster. And still no land, but a Spell Stutter might encourage me to go for the Fairy Mastermind instead. But we'll have to do that during an opponent's turn. Now we can draw another card here, so yeah, let's go through to combat. Go in down the middle now and try and get this Verduran Enchantress off the field. Draw to the Discovery for attacking, and there at least we make a land this turn. Still missing a swamp for the Tainted Isle though. So I'll try and hold off on the Spell Stutter for as long as possible. If Yarok comes down here then we'll allow it. I mean, we won't be able to counter if he plays it with this anyway. But we would have allowed it through, because I want to be holding off on counter spells for like board wipes and stuff, which I assume are attached to sagas, so that will also give us a chance to get down Nimris as well, so that we can get additional card advantage from all the flash stuff that we're looking to do. And we can make this player tap out anyway during the next turn with the Mistbind Click, so that'll buy us a turn against him. Another Knight token coming down from the saga. Destiny Spinner, an enchantment creature, is going to cantrip with the Enchantress, which don't forget is goaded this turn but has an easy attack over here. Noteworthy, the land here is a Nesting Grounds as well. So removing one of the counters from this to get a consistent Knight token every turn. The Knight swings in at us and the Enchantress goes in at the right. Expand the sphere now. Look at the top 6 cards, put 2 lands from among them onto the battlefield tap, the rest on the bottom. Doesn't look like our opponent hit any lands off that. So we'll go through to the end step here and get this Nimris down. And that triggers Alela for the first time. So we will get a Fairy Rogue token into play, and that will trigger the Kindred Discovery because that triggers on tokens as well. So we'll draw a couple of cards here, hopefully get us into that swamp we're after. No, it does get us into an Arcane Signet though. And we see a Talion's Messenger as well, so that will be a loot effect, which might be worth getting down. doesn't have flash, so no reason not to do it here. We get into more counter magic in the mana drain. So if we're not going to make lands, getting an Arcane Signet down is probably a good idea. And then surely we're going to draw a card on attacking here, so we will attack. We'll go in for some commander damage at the left. And then there's definitely no reaches over here, so swing 2 in down the middle. And then we draw 3 cards to the Kindred Discovery. Holding this back because it's 6 toughness makes it a decent blocker. Wow, and are we going to be that unlucky here? I've just played a Reese the Redeemed game in which, well, you may have seen it by now, maybe not. Okay, in Ottawara. I couldn't get into lands to save my life in that game either, and I drew considerably fewer cards than this, so yeah, it is pretty unlucky. So we get 2 triggers because we've hit 2 different opponents. Yarok will be goaded, and the Enchantress will as well. Unfortunately, we're not seeing any creatures over here, otherwise it would hopefully be able to block the Enchantress. So we'll get down this Ottawara as a land, seeing as how we keep missing lands. And need to get rid of 3 cards from hand, so can we play anything here? We obviously want to hold up interaction. I think just making a bunch of fairies will be fine, so yeah, I suppose we can just discard some stuff here. So let's get rid of the Talion's Messenger and Mistbind Click I don't really want to get rid of, but we've got plenty of counter magic now, so that should slow our opponents down sufficiently. And then let's get rid of the Titan level at Yara, because hopefully we can protect the Kindred Discovery. I'll regret getting rid of that if not, but yeah, we'll get rid of the Rewind here instead. I know that somehow someone's going to get rid of the Kindred Discovery as soon as we discard the Lityara. Okay, that is a Muldrifter being played with the Dork. It's not legendary, so we could counter this, but it's not worth countering, so we'll use this opportunity to get down the Fairy Mastermind, I think, because Fairy Mastermind will draw us a card as well. So that triggers our Alela for another Fairy token and the Nimris, and that continues to trigger the enchantment, which gets us into a Wretched Confluence. Could get rid of some problem things here from our opponents. Alright, and there, of course, we get to choose between a couple of swamps. So we'll put the Watery Grave into our hand. And then we see a Mystical Tutor as well. Not sure what I would grab with that, to be honest. Probably just something boring like a Cyclonic Rift towards the end of the game. Anyway, our opponent draws a second card to the Muldrifter, which means we draw. And that time it is a Dimir Signet, so we are starting to get into the mana here. And our opponent will draw 2 cards twice to the Muldrifter. That was hardcast, so it stays in play. And they do draw 4 cards thanks to the Yarok, so 9 cards in hand at the moment. And he gets into his own Cloud of Fairies, so Cloud of Fairies with Yarok in play is going to untap 4 lands. And he does have multiple flyers in play now, so that it's not as easy to goad him. And then we see a Lightning Greaves for our opponent, trying to protect the Yarok. I think we just allow this in play as well. Lightning Greaves goes on to the Yarok. And then a Dance of the Many. When it enters the battlefield, create a token that's a copy of a non-token creature. And that has this player scoop it up, so it's obviously a too strong a game for him, unfortunately. So we'll just allow this. Dance of the Many becomes a copy of the Cloud of Fairies and the Muldrifter. So untapping 2 lands twice again. And then he's floating mana before the second resolution happens. Does have an Ancient Tomb here to generate more than 1 mana. Then untaps the 2 coloured pieces here. We'll draw 4 cards from the Muldrifter, and does have some mana held up. So we could get rid of these creatures here with the Wretched Confluence, and then continue to swing in this direction. Does mean tapping down a decent amount of mana, obviously. And then it's a Sylvan Library for our opponent. We'll allow that into play as well, really just holding up the counter spells for something that's really devastating to us. Something that messes with our rocks or something like that. Kinda wishing that I hadn't got rid of the Mistbind Click at this point though, because I would have used that on my opponent next turn. A Takenumar going to mill 3. And there we see a Phantasmal Image, which they do take. A Rejuvenating Springs, and a Talisman was milled as well. So now that a player's scooped, it does minimise the amount of flash stuff that we can do, unfortunately. This thing has to attack in, so does my opponent want to gang up on the Yarok to get rid of it? Or is he hoping that Yarok will help deal with us? He takes the commander damage. A 2/2 Knight being made again, because don't forget this had a counter removed, so it goes back to chapter 2. And then we see Omen of the Hunt. Still haven't managed to get rid of the Enchantress, so that draws again. which will draw into the Fairy Mastermind and allow us to do the same. And there we see another land, which I don't mind seeing. And it is noteworthy, of course, that we can't actually counter the enchantments until we get rid of this thing either, so maybe should have goaded this instead of the Enchantress. Nesting Ground's going to remove a counter from that again. And the Verduran Enchantress should go down here anyway. It depends on if our opponent wants to sacrifice his Muldrifter. He probably doesn't want to sacrifice anything here, actually. If he's wanting to flicker the Dance of the Many, maybe. Maybe bounce and recast it. Because obviously the tokens can't go down here without him sacrificing that enchantment. And also, if it's a 2-on-1, then our opponent may well just let it through just for the sake of giving us a headache. So let's go for Mystical Tutor. And that will trigger Alela and Nimris, which will resolve first before the Tutor does. Draws us into Heuristic Study, which I don't think we need. And then it is Vamp Tutor and Mana Crypt. Difficult choice, but I think we take the Vamp Tutor there. And then we can actually draw into whatever we tutor for with the Mystical Tutor here. We can always go for the Cyclonic Rift with the Vamp Tutor now, so why don't we protect our board some by going for just the Fierce Guardianship might do. Don't have Force of Will in this deck, and maybe we should, but yeah, go for the Fierce Guardianship. Alright, so let's shock in this Watery Grave. With Cloud of Fairies, Cloudstone Curio, and Archmage of Echoes, we've actually got infinite fairies, I think. What we can't do is a Labman effect because I didn't include anything like that in the deck. But that's something to do in the next few turns, maybe. I won't do it here. Let's get down the Demir's Signet to accelerate our mana a little bit. And then we can get down the Cloudstone Curio here. If we decide to try and combo off at some point, then we can. But we're holding up the Wretched Confluence, obviously Counter Magic, Vamp Tutor and everything, so yeah, let's try and do some goading here. We've got infinite mana with Hullbreaker Horror, Sol Ring and a Mana Crypt as well if we wanted to tutor that out with this. So there's multiple combos that we could go for. So we'll leave back our big toughness creatures and we'll just go in at D-Manny and try and get him to lose this Destiny Spinner. Draw a bunch of cards to the Kindred Discovery. Finally get into a swamp straight off the top. There is a Snare Master Sprite, which is just a cheap fairy pretty much. Fact or Fiction's obviously decent as well. And Alela only triggers once because there's only one opponent we've hit, so we'll goad the Destiny Spinner this time, like I said. And then just pass through the turn like this should be fine. Alright, so see if our opponent pays for Dance of the Many here, or if he just wants to give up on the tokens. Yeah, just decides to give up on that, so losing out on these tokens here. Sylvan Library going to eat up some life potentially. So our opponent draws his second card, meaning the Fairy Mastermind going to continue to do work for us. And that gets us into a land. I discarded all the lands previously, so good to see that one. And now we see Phantasmal Image, so not sure what they're targeting there, but I don't suppose it matters. Kind of cringing every time Yarok does something, to be honest. Just targets the Cloud of Fairies, so going to float a bunch of mana with that. And then it is a Deadeye Navigator, so I think that is definitely the type of card that is worth a mana drain here. And we do have counters for the counters. So that triggers the Nimris and Alela. Cloudstone Curio triggers when a token from our commander enters. So we will bounce back the Cloud of Fairies here. Then Nimris resolves. That is a Frantic Search. We do have 3 lands held up, so yeah, we'll take that. I imagine we're doing Vampiric Tutor during our opponent's turn at least, but good to hold on to the Frantic Search, I think. Deadeye Navigator successfully being countered, although it may well have been bait from our opponent. Reanimate goes on to the Deadeye Navigator. We don't have any cheap means of going for spot removal here, which could be useful with Deadeye Navigator on the stack. Maybe we could go for it here with Frantic Search. And obviously no triggers here because this is the second time that we're doing something during our opponent's turn. Alright, just draws us into lands, so get rid of the Pain Land and the other fetch. Untap our Jewel Sources. That cleared those lands off the top at least. Yeah, going for the Spell Stutter here should be fine then. And that is successfully countered. 4 cards left in our opponent's hand, so we'll see what else he's got in store for us. A Necromancy to try and get the get that thing out as well, so yeah, he's swallowing up our counter magic, unfortunately. This is going to open up the play for this player over here. But he's doing exactly what he should be doing. Our opponents did know about the Fierce Guardianship because we showed it to them off the fast tutor. Alright, and our opponent just scooping it up there, so he might regret that if this player decides to do something against us here. Yeah, he said that he was trying to go infinite with Venser in hand. I mean, he doesn't know that he won't be able to do that, I suppose, because, like I said, he doesn't know what the Sagas player is going to do here. Should have played it out another turn cycle, really, because now's the chance for a board wipe. A Phyrexian Scriptures is exactly the type of thing that I wanted to avoid, so it might have to be Cyclonic Rift then. We do draw a card. Yeah, if we had something like Force of Will, what we could do here is go Vamp Tutor into the Force of Will and then counter that. Because what our opponent's going to be able to do here is put another Saga counter onto this. So our previous opponent being absolutely relevant there in the end. Yeah, it looks like we're going to lose our stuff here. Really wishing I had Force of Will in the deck now. So we might as well go Vamp Tutor, draw some cards before the board gets wiped. Cloudstone Curio triggers again. We can bounce something back to our hand, I suppose. Get into a Bitter Blossom, which is not bad after a board wipe. And we'll bounce Nimris back to our hand. Then there's a Vendilion Click. Dimir Aqueduct is part of a combo as well. So we'll take the Dimir Aqueduct here and try and show off some kind of combo if the board's going to get wiped anyway. And then we tutor for just boring old Cyclonic Rift, I suppose. So the Phyrexian Scriptures enters and puts a plus counter on a target creature. Then, like we said, the Nesting Grounds can put the second counter onto the Phyrexian Scriptures. Like I said before, this is exactly why I went for the Fierce Guardianship, because I was worried about a board wipe from a Saga. So the board is successfully wiped. Our commander will go back into the command zone. And I'm wishing that I'd held on to the Snare Master Sprite now, because yeah, we need to play cheap fairies into the Cloud of Fairies so that we can untap the bounce land here and get infinite mana. Alright, that is a Dowsing Dagger, which is good to untap with the Cloud of Fairies as well. We do get a bunch of mana from the Mana Drain, so do we just go for Hullbreaker Horror while we've got this surplus of mana? Our opponent could wipe the board again with the Nesting Grounds and the Phyrexian Scriptures, but we could force him to do it. Yeah, let's just do that. So Hullbreaker Horror into play. Let's go for, we'll put the colourless mana through the Signet. We can go for Bitter Blossom, and Hullbreaker Horror can return a permanent to its owner's hand. How is this worded exactly? Exile all opponents' graveyards, don't really care about that, so we'll bounce the Destiny Spinner. We want to see this thing go down preferably. Then we'll go for the Dimir Aqueduct and we'll get that Otawara back into our hand. And then, seeing as how we're just setting up again this turn, why don't we go after our commander again? Should be fine. And that will allow us to bounce something else. It can just be the History of Benalia. So yeah, if our opponent wants to remove counters with the Nesting Grounds and the Phyrexian Scriptures, then he can do that, but it will swallow up mana. We'll draw a card from the Kindred Discovery and our commander entering. There's a Consider, so we've at least got something to do on our opponent's turn now. So I'll just get rid of the Dowsing Dagger here and a couple of lands, doing that to hand size. And there we go, exile all opponents' graveyards. So if our opponent allows this, then he's not going to be able to wipe the board every turn with the Phyrexian Scriptures. And there we go, that goes into the bin, so hopefully it'll stay there. We can bounce a spell back to his hand if he decides to go in for his commander or something. Hopefully that will really slow him down. Turns out the Consider was a much better draw than it initially looked. Now we see a Savine's Reclamation going after the Verduran Enchantress. That's fine. Can soon have that blown up with the Wretched Confluence. And the good thing is that this returns spells to hand, so it does dodge the Destiny Spinner, which we will also allow into play. And then it's a Minimus Containment, trying to go onto our Hullbreaker Horror. I think that removes the abilities. Yeah, it just turns it into a treasure, so we have to do this on the stack. We'll go for Consider, and we'll use the Hullbreaker Horror to return, where is it, a spell you don't control to its owner's hand. That can be the Containment, and obviously Alela triggers here as well. Dig Through Time, much worse now that we've just had our graveyard exiled, but we might be able to put something in the bin here. Sword of the Animist, I think, is a bit too late for that, so we'll put that into the graveyard. And our opponent with 7 cards in hand, just passing the turn here. We did get into another counterspell, so that's good. In Unwind, have to hold that up. Bitter Blossom triggers for the first time, loses us a life, and makes us a fairy, which will draw us a card. Goes very nicely with the Kindred Discovery. Alright, and that is a Scion of Una, so yeah, that's nice to have Shroud on our stuff. Get into a Deadly Rollick as well, so that onto the Destiny Spinner should be fine, because we can only do -2/-2 on this. Play out the Otawara as a land, and then we'll finally get down this Archmage of Echoes, I think. And that will allow us to keep bouncing stuff, so yeah, until our opponent deals with the Hullbreaker Horror, it's pretty much rinse and repeat here. And we'll be able to start dealing damage with this thing now, a 7/8. So that comes down, draws us, and Cloudstone Curio going to trigger again. Luckily we can say no. We'll play the Cloud of Fairies now as well. So Archmage of Echoes is going to make a copy of that. We will bounce the Verdurant Enchantress. So down it comes. And Cloudstone Curio going to trigger. We are not going to make use of the copy of the Cloudstone Curio. Cloud of Fairies allows us to untap the Dimir Aqueduct, meaning that we gain mana. And then the original Cloud of Fairies will enter. And in response to that, we'll float some mana. And then Cloud of Fairies can untap the exact same lands. Not much point bouncing anything with the Cloudstone Curio. Do get into some swamp mana in the Uurg. So we'll go for Scion of Una here. With the mana that we floated. Hullbreaker Horror can bounce the Omen of the Hunt. So we'll get a couple of Scion of Unas here, which means that all of our fairies will have +1/+1 and Shroud, including the Scion of Una, because they'll each give each other Shroud. Cloudstone Curio we will use to bounce the original Cloud of Fairies, so that we can make mana with that. And if we get into a 2 or 1 mana fairy, we can do the Cloud of Fairies thing infinitely with Cloudstone Curio. Alright, so let's just go through to combat here. We've drawn into Mithril Cult for our commander, which is good. Should be able to get our opponent in the next few turns, hopefully, because he's going to find it really difficult to get through our Hullbreaker Horror, I imagine. Get into some spot removal and a fairy board wipe. So knocking our opponent down to 7, we'll see if he can do anything on his turn, but like I said, it's not looking likely. So again, it is Minimus Containment. Yeah, I suppose we just have to go for the straight up unwind on that. And we'll go after the Utopia Sprawl being bounced. Alela triggers again. We actually gain mana from the unwind as well, because again the bounce land taps for 2 mana. Don't often play these, but there are utility cases for them where you can untap them and tap them down again and gain mana. If we have something like Urza's Incubator to make this cost 1 mana, then it's even easier. Unfortunately, our opponent's running up against really obnoxious Dimir control here. Alright, so there's a Teferi's Protection. Yeah, I mean, we can force him to cast that again, I suppose. So I'll just play a Brainstorm. And the Hullbreaker Horror doing an incredible amount of work here. It's noteworthy that we could use the Infernal Grasp on one of our own creatures in order to trigger the Hullbreaker Horror if we need to, but we've just given all of our stuff Shroud, so we've switched off that avenue. Mithril Cult should target as well, which we've also switched off, so yeah, I've only just realised that. Anyway, let the Teferi's Protection resolve now, and they'll get themselves another turn here. Brainstorm will put some stuff on top, so that can be the useless Mithril Cult and a land. And then we could shuffle things around during our upkeep with the now Fairy Harbinger that's in our deck. We could do that at the end of this turn actually, because we're untapping lands. So let's do just that. We'll go for the Fairy Harbinger. We'll actually draw some cards first, won't we, because we're going to make a copy here. So the Archmage of Echoes going to trigger. Fairy Harbinger will allow us to search up a fairy. And I suppose we could have bounced one of these Scion of Unas with the Cloudstone Curio if we want to get rid of all the Shroud. We will tutor with the copy of the Fairy Harbinger. And it can just be a Spell Stutter Sprite, should be fine. But with Cloudstone Curio we'll be able to go for multiple tutors with the Harbinger, which could be useful. So like I said, could bounce the 2 Scion of Unas here. So that we've got a Scion of Una to recast and maybe get some more card draw and stuff going, but I'm trying to go as quickly as I can for my opponent here because he's been very patient with us. We did draw into the Spell Stutter Sprite and all that, so we can tutor again. And let's just make it the Olbira here so that we can get rid of our opponent on his own turn when he phases back in, hopefully. So if that's what we're doing, we will make use of the Cloudstone Curio actually. We'll bring back the Scion of Una. Alright, so with Bitter Blossom on the stack, we'll go for the Olbira now. And we will get a copy of that, but only get to keep one, of course. It does mean that an Olbira will enter into an Olbira, which could make all the difference in other games. We will bounce the Fairy Harbinger so that we can replay it simply for the sake of replaying it. And then we choose which one we want to keep. We will keep the original. And the Obira entered into the token copy, so each opponent loses a life. Or at least our opponent would lose a life if he wasn't phased out and protected by the Teferi's protection. So yeah, all we ultimately have to do here, I imagine, is go through to our opponent's upkeep and wait for him to phase back in. Not much point in swinging in while he's phased out. Alright, so get through to the upkeep. Let's go for the Scion of Uurg first. Shame that we can't have two Albiras in play to speed this up. Get another copy of the Scion of Uurg, so this is another means of slowly buffing your army. You could keep getting copies of Scions of Uurg and get a +1 buff every time you do that. Obviously we're just wanting to have our opponent lose a life to the Obira. So it's 1 to the token entering and 1 to the Scion of Uurg. And then Alela will trigger as well, making a token, and that will trigger the Obira as well. And we are down to 30 cards in the library here. Could maybe have bounced the Obira there and then recast it, and it would have drained our opponent by 1 life again. So we've got another chance to do that here if we want to. And yeah, let's go for Obira being put back into our hand. Then recast the Obira again. The copy entering can bounce back the original Scion of Uurg, and then the original will enter and trigger the copy again. And obviously we keep the original again. So I think we can get our opponent here. We'll just go for the Scion of Uurg, and that'll put them down to 1. And yeah, our opponent's seen enough, decided to scoop it up there. He was incredibly patient there, so I do appreciate that. Can always rely on D-Manny to get a full game out of him, and yeah, there's nothing he could have done there anyway. So yeah, a bit of a slog towards the end there. I apologise to my opponent, but hopefully you all enjoyed the gameplay. Another great one with Alela Cunning Conqueror. Big thank you to the patrons for their constant support of the channel as well. I'm tribalkai. Thank you for watching.